I'm going to show you an ancient Chinese method of divination. Perhaps you know that divination is really a kind of fortune-telling. But this particular kind of divination is based on what some people believe to be the very oldest of all the Chinese classics, the Book of Changes. I say divination is something like fortune-telling, but it's a little bit more highbrow than ordinary fortune-telling. One wouldn't, I think, presume to ask so hoary a book of wisdom as the I Ching what to bet on the stock market. Rather, one asks questions about one's spiritual, psychological state, or very great momentous decisions of life. The very old and orthodox way of consulting the Book of Changes is to use the stalks of the yarrow plant. A number of stalks are taken and divided at random, and so calculations are made. This is a rather long and elaborate way of doing it, and a not so ancient but equally respectable way is to use Chinese coins. You know, the kind of coins that have a hole through the middle, and so that you can carry them on a string around your neck. So if I would ask the Book of Changes, what is the best thing for me in my present state? That is the sort of question that would be appropriate under circumstances like this. So we take the coins, and we shake them, and drop them. And according to the way they fall, heads or tails, we get a positive or a negative reading. In this particular case, we get a negative reading. The symbol which records the negative reading being the drawing of a broken line. That line is called a yin, or negative line. We do it again. And this time the reading is again negative. And we record it. We shake them again. This time the reading is positive. We record that by an unbroken line, or a yang line, Y-A-N-G, representing the positive principle. Again, and once more the line is negative. Again, and the line is once more negative. And then a final sixth time, and the line is positive. And so we get this figure. And in order to know what it means, we have to take a look at a very, very ancient diagram, which may be familiar to you. Perhaps you've seen this diagram on Chinese bowls, or jewelry sometimes, or carving in jade. This is called Gua, or the 8 trigrams. In the center of the design, you see this figure, which may be familiar to some of you as the trademark of the Northern Pacific Railroad. But actually, its meaning in China is the symbol of these two fundamental principles, the negative and the positive, the yang and the yin, which are held to lie at the root of all phenomena in the world. The word yang, which is represented by this comma or fish that is white, means the south or bright side of a mountain. And then yin, Y-I-N, you romanize that, means the shady or dark side of a mountain. And thus, respectively, they're called the male and the female principles. Now, you will obviously notice that with the symbolism of a light and dark side of a mountain, that you can't have a mountain with only one side. The two sides must always go together. And so in the same way, the Chinese feel that the positive and the negative, the light and the dark, the male and the female, the auspicious and the inauspicious, always go together in human life because one cannot be distinguished without the other. in the second chapter of his book, the old philosopher Lao Tzu, whom I've mentioned many times in these programs, says, when all the world recognizes beauty to be beautiful, there is already ugliness. When all the world recognizes good to be good, there is already evil. Thus, to be and not to be arise mutually. And you can say that to be is the principle yang, and not to be the principle yin, respectively the positive and the negative. And now outside the rotating figure of the positive and negative principles, you will find these 8 trigrams. Trigrams meaning symbols of 3 lines. And here you will see the broken and the unbroken lines, such as I drew when I was consulting the oracle, the broken being the yin lines and the unbroken, the yang, the positive lines. And these trigrams represent the 8 fundamental principles or elements which, according to this book of changes, are involved in every life situation. For example, the one at the top means heaven or sky, the one below means earth. This is the father, this is the mother. Over this side, for example, this one means fire, and over here, that one means water. And as you will see, we derived 2 of these trigrams. The point of the oracle being that every situation in life is a combination of 2 of these principles in preponderance. And the ones that we have here is this one repeated twice. And this one has the meaning of a mountain. A mountain over a mountain. Now there are 64 possible combinations of these 8 trigrams, which makes the meaning of each combination pretty difficult to remember. So we'd better go and look at the Book of Changes itself and see what it has to say about this particular one, what advice the oracle would want to give me in answer to my question about my present situation. The mountain over the mountain happens to be, let's see, that's number 52. The figure of the mountain, of course, it has a symbolism. It means the idea of quietness or keeping still. And so when we have keeping still, quietness above quietness, we get a whole emblem whose meaning is profound calm. And so the oracle says, keeping still. Keeping his back still so that he no longer feels his body. He goes into his courtyard and does not see his people. No blame. Mountains standing close together, the image of keeping still. Thus the superior man does not permit his thoughts to go beyond his situation. The heart thinks constantly. This cannot be changed. But the movements of the heart, that is, a man's thoughts, should restrict themselves to the immediate situation. All thinking that goes beyond this only makes the heart sore. Now you can see that that's pretty generalized advice. And it's appropriate in a way to the question, because the question was vague and the answer was vague. But the symbolism of this answer is simply that sitting so as to keep one's back still so that one's back is not noticed is self-forgetfulness. And keeping one's thoughts to the immediate situation means the practice of meditation or calmness or quietness, and that's what I'm advised to do. It's good advice. Now you may say, well, this is a thoroughly crazy way of coming to decisions, especially if I were to ask something more specific than this. If I had asked advice on some momentous decision I had to make, we would naturally say, from our modern scientific point of view, that flipping coins to come to the great decisions of life is the stupidest thing we could possibly do. After all, it neglects all rational cogitation about our situations. We would say, well, it takes no account of the data It makes no intelligent assessment of the probabilities. And we, before we make any important decision, we think over all the factors involved. We balance the pros against the cons. We balance assets against deficit, and so on. We go into the situation and think it out thoroughly. And therefore, what could be more superstitious than relying upon some oracle that has entirely to do with the purely chance falling of the coins that have no relation to the problem whatsoever? That's our contemporary point of view about all methods of fortune-telling, divination, and so on and so forth. But now look, someone who believed in this system, an old-fashioned Chinese, might say to us, but listen, first of all, when you estimate the data, when you consider the facts that are involved in any particular decision, how do you know exactly what facts are involved? After all, you're going to sign a contract. And the facts you think about that are relevant to this contract are the state of your own business, the state of the other fellow's business, the prospects, the market, and so on and so forth. But something that you may never have considered at all may enter into the situation and change it utterly. The man with whom you're going to make the contract may slip on a banana skin and so hurt his head and become inefficient in business. How would anyone ever think of such an eventuality in taking a sane and rational view of the situation? Or he might say to us, how do you know when you've got in enough data? After all, the data, the causes, the problems involved in any particular situation are virtually infinite. And as a matter of fact, you stop getting in data, stop getting information as to how to solve the problem, either when you're tired of it or when the time comes to act and you haven't time to collect any more data. And he would say that is just as irrational as flipping coins, because you decide when to stop investigating in a very arbitrary way. So are you really very much more than us? Well, we would say, what about probabilities? After all, we rely a great deal upon statistics in order to make decisions. And he would say again about statistics. Yes, statistics are all very well when you want to know what a lot of people are going to do. For example, if you flip a coin, you know that if you flip a coin 100 times, there is going to be quite a probability that you will toss half of the time heads, half of the time tails. 1,000 tosses, and you will get nearer to an exact half and half. But each individual toss, the chance is 50-50 whether it will be heads or tails. In other words, you may have tossed 999 times, and you may have had 400 tails tosses. You may have had the rest heads tosses. So the probability will be on the thousandth that it will go to tails because that's had the lesser number of tosses. But actually, your chance on it coming up heads or tails at that particular moment is, again, 50-50. And the probability really tells you nothing. And so in the same way with the actuarial tables of insurance companies, they will say the average lifespan of an adult male is 65 years. But on any individual case, these tables do not tell us when I am going to die. And so our Chinese critic might say, well, so you see, I myself am of a somewhat skeptical temperament, and I very much doubt, in fact, whether this way of coming to decisions really works. Or, let us put it this way, we can never really prove whether any method of coming to decisions really works. I mean, I may make a foolish decision, and I call it foolish because as a result of it, I get killed. But there's absolutely no way of showing that my getting killed at that moment didn't preserve me from a worse fate, from making mistakes that involved the lives of many other people. If I so-called succeed by making a right decision, and I earn $1 million, there's no way of showing that this isn't so bad for my character that's the worst thing that could possibly happen. So we never really know whether the outcome of a decision is a failure or a success, not in the long run, because only the unknown, what comes next, will show whether it was good or bad, and the unknown stretches infinitely into the future. But it seems to me that the importance of this old Chinese book of divination is twofold. First of all, there's a bad side to it, a distinct disadvantage in Chinese culture. The Chinese came so much to rely on the Book of Changes and to use its system of symbols, those trigrams I showed you, to use these for classifying all natural phenomena, that in the course of time it became a very rigid thing, and it excluded the perception of novelty. Now, the warning and the advantage to us of that is we can do the same thing with scientific method. There are certain kinds of personality who become very rigid in their scientific ideas and simply automatically exclude certain possibilities because they don't conform with alleged scientific dogma. Take, for example, what we call ESP, or extrasensory perception. I rather call it extraordinary sensory perception. Still, there is good reason to believe that there is extremely strong evidence for something of this kind occurring. And yet many scientific people will ignore that evidence because they say things like that simply can't happen. And that is to fall into the same rut that the Chinese fell into when they relied too meticulously upon the classification of the world and of events found in the Book of Changes. But there's a positive side to the picture. For this Book of Changes is founded on a view of life which is very suggestive to us, which is in accord with certain points of view that now develop in our own science. A way of life, a way of looking at life, which sees not so much the causal relationship between events as the pattern of events. Let me try and show that difference. When we think of causality, we think chiefly of the way events are determined by their past. It's as if events were a lot of marbles, and they're thrown together and they knock each other around. And therefore, in tracing the movement of any particular marble, we try to find out which other marbles knocked it, and so trace it back and back and back. And until quite recent times, the whole view of Western science was based on the idea of causality, how things are influenced by past things. But the point of view that underlies the Book of Changes, and the Chinese never really applied to their science, they applied it rather to their art and perhaps their philosophy of law. The point of view here is different. It is instead of understanding events by relation to past causes, it understands events by relation to their present pattern. And in other words, it comprehends them by taking a total view instead of what we might call a linear view. If, for example, we can find a suitable analogy for the Western way of looking at things, we might say it is understanding events in accordance with the order of words. For example, I can say, this dog has no bark, and then this tree has no bark. Now, the meaning of bark in these two sentences is determined by what went before them. I make sounds before I say the sound bark. Before I say bark, I say this dog has no. Now, if I want to know what bark means, I have to go back to what happened in the past. But if you take the order not of words, but what I would rather call the order of design, we get a rather different situation. Supposing I draw two small circles. And these correspond to the two words bark. They're both the same. But now, supposing a design arises around those two circles. And then at once we see that in their context, those two original circles have quite different meaning. But you see their relationship to their meaning all at once. I mean, imagine, supposing these designs had not been drawn by a brush, line after line after line, but had appeared all together at once as you see the image appear when you're developing a photographic plate. Then you would see that the meaning of each part of the design is relative to the rest of it as you see it now at this moment. And so in the same way, the fundamental philosophy of the Book of Changes and of the Chinese idea of the relationship between events is to understand every event in its present context. Not understanding it so much as we do by what went before it, but rather understanding it in terms of what goes with it. Thus, the idea of the Book of Changes is to reveal through its symbols the total pattern of the moment when the question is asked, on the supposition that the pattern of this moment governs even the tossing of the coins. Now then, the interesting comparison that arises out of this is that because we in the West have tended to understand events in accordance with the order of words, in accordance with the order of causality, we have evolved a conception of nature as based on law. In other words, when we ask for the explanation of any natural phenomenon, we look for that explanation in words, in a formulation that will describe a law. On the other hand, the Chinese have not evolved the idea of a law of nature, but something quite different, but equally valid and equally useful. There is indeed a word in Chinese for law, in very much our sense of law. It's a rather interesting word because as it was originally written, it was a picture like this. That's a picture of an iron cauldron, and beside it, a figure holding a knife. This is the Chinese word for law, TSE, Z, which most corresponds to our idea of law. And the reason for this symbol is that in ancient times, some of the old emperors commanded the laws to be written on the iron sacrificial cauldrons. And when the people came to offer sacrifice and put their offerings into the cauldrons, they could read the laws written upon the cauldrons. But at the time when those ancient emperors ordered the laws to be written in this way, there were certain sages and scholars who said, no, you shouldn't write the laws down. Because if you write the laws down, the people will develop a litigious spirit. That is to say, they will start quibbling. And therefore, the property of the order of nature is sometimes called in Chinese not this. The expression wu, zi, wu meaning not, wu zi is used, meaning apparently lawless. But it doesn't really mean lawless. For example, if we go for a moment to Chinese ideas of civil law, a good judge does not base his decisions on this kind of law, written down law, because he knows that no written law can apply to all the complex multiplicity of circumstances that may arise. And so he bases his decisions on what the Chinese call not law, but justice. This word is pronounced I. And justice in this sense corresponds rather to our idea of equity. It is the sensibility for order and reasonableness that is embodied in an individual. He hasn't got it clearly written down, but he is the sort of person who is able to judge in any particular circumstance whether a certain decision is fair or not fair. And they much rather trust a man who has E in him than a man who has a thorough knowledge of the rules. And so we come thus to a conception of the order of nature that is one of the most important words in the Chinese language. And that is a word which originally meant the markings in jade, the grain in wood, or the fiber in muscle, and it's pronounced li. This is a character then meaning really the basic fundamental pattern of things. But such an image is used as the markings in jade or the grain in wood, because this is an extremely subtle, complex pattern, a huge area of events all happening together at once, which has to be taken in at a glance, in the same way as we take design in at a glance, understood at a glance, and therefore is not capable of formulation in the order of words. And so Li, meaning perhaps organic pattern, is the fundamental Chinese idea of the order of nature. In other words, when we think of beauty, we know very clearly what is beautiful and what is not. But it's absolutely impossible to write down a set of laws and rules as to how one will create beautiful objects. In mathematics, for example, mathematicians often feel that certain equations, certain expressions are peculiarly beautiful. And mathematicians, because they are meticulous people, try to think out exactly why is this beautiful. Could we make up a rule for beauty? And yet they come to the conclusion that if we could make up a rule and apply it in mathematics, and always by the use of this rule get a beautiful result, eventually those results would cease to impress us as being beautiful. They would become sterile and dry. And so in the same way, the order of nature, the order of justice, the order of beauty are things which we can know in ourselves, but we cannot write down in black and white. And therefore, the superior man is one who has the sensibility for these things in himself.
I was trying to explain what training in Zen Buddhism does to change human consciousness. And I showed that it takes away our ingrained tendency to block ourselves in thought and action by the mechanisms of self-consciousness. It doesn't mean that a person can't be self-conscious anymore, that he can't think about what he has to do and how to control himself. But he no longer experiences his observing self, you know, the self that says, what will other people think? Do I make sense? Am I right? He no longer senses this as an obstacle. And he receives training in acting spontaneously rather than deliberately. And as I pointed out, that is a way of action which we are not ordinarily taught. All our education consists in knowing how to act and think deliberately. And this gives a certain stickiness or artificiality to everything that we do. But when he has been put through this training, which involves a kind of dying to himself, that is to say, he gets in a situation where he's faced with an unanswerable question, the koan, the Zen problem for meditation. And all his wits are exhausted in trying to answer this question being in effect, however it is phrased, to perform a perfectly spontaneous, genuine, natural act. Express your true self. And nobody can do that intentionally. You know, there's a proverb in India that if you think of a monkey while you're drinking medicine, the medicine doesn't cure you. So imagine a person trying not to think of a monkey while taking medicine. Well, that's the sort of bind we get into when we try intentionally to be natural. And it's only when all our intentional wisdom, our contriving wisdom is frustrated and brought to an end, brought to a kind of death, at any rate temporarily, that a completely genuine action is possible. As a Western saying goes, man's extremity is God's opportunity. Now, you might raise the question, how does a person express this kind of freedom? I finished last time on the note of the Zen student being as free as the clouds and the water, the image of the clouds drifting unobstructedly through the sky, the water flowing on, always taking the line of least resistance, but always overcoming even the hardest obstacles. If a person acts without inner conflict, and he acts with true spontaneity, how does he act? What does he do to express himself? And I think one of the very best examples of this is from the influence of Zen upon Far Eastern painting. The art of China and Japan has been very, very profoundly influenced by Zen. Now, I suppose most of you know that Chinese painting is intimately connected with Chinese writing, which was originally a pictographic language. You can see, for example, here how at the top left, the pictogram of mountains has become the formal symbol written with a brush, which now means mountain or hill in Chinese characters. It's pretty obvious how concrete objects can be represented by a pictogram, and it's interesting to see how abstract ideas can also be conveyed. The next drawing you see there shows at the top right the pictogram of a lizard, and below the formal brush character as now written, which means change, perhaps because this was a chameleon who changed color according to his background, or perhaps because the movements of a lizard are so slippery and rapid. And then again, you can see another abstract idea conveyed. The pictogram at the top shows a mat with a pattern on it. And the formal brush-written character below means cause, because just as a mat is a firm basis for something, so it represents the cause of a certain situation. Now, every child brought up in China learns the discipline of writing these characters. And to learn, as it were, the alphabet of characters, how, for example, to make a cross stroke, which should look something like a bone. Or he learns perhaps the character which is supposed to contain all the characters, all the strokes. The character meaning eternal. A lot of you have seen this writing and work done by Mr. Mikami, who's a real artist. And I don't pretend to be any great calligrapher, but I'm just showing you that the art of the brush involves endless practice to get these things correct. In other words, I haven't done this very well here because the top of this character should be more stubby. But of course I'm doing something I shouldn't really do at all, and that's touch up. But just as there is in learning, or all the characters are made up of certain basic elements, there are certain basic strokes. This is supposed to involve about 7 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I don't know where the 7th is. But in learning these basic strokes, which are practiced again and again and again, the person studying Chinese writing acquires, as it were, not an alphabet in our sense, but an alphabet of strokes. Now, in exactly the same way, in the art of painting, Chinese painting is made up of an alphabet of various strokes that convey various things. And you can see, for example, how the brush lends itself quite naturally to drawing certain forms. If we take, for example, just, that's rather wiggly, but here is the leaf of a bamboo. See? The brush draws them naturally. And it even conveys, with the part at the end where the ink runs a little dry, the tip of the leaf where it may get a bit ragged. And so, with immense rapidity, all kinds of different sorts of leaves can be drawn with a brush, little leaves, or wisps of grass. And there is a book called The Mustard Seed Garden, which is published in this country under the title The Tao of Painting, T-A-O, of Painting, by Mei Ze, which shows all the formal executions the artist goes through to convey different shapes, clouds, so on, all in accordance with the nature of the brush. Now here, for example, is a painting by the Japanese artist Josetsu, showing a very masterly study of bamboos. If you look a little bit over to the left of the painting, you can see a spray of bamboos almost just within view. And actually the painting shows a rather amusing subject. It's a man trying to catch a fish in a gourd. And this is suggestive of the futile attempt to grasp life in intellectual terms, to catch the mystery of being in words. And in the same way, there is a Chinese proverb which says, "One picture is worth 10,000 words." You see, the problem is, painting is perhaps a little closer to the real world than talking. If I wanted to show you, for example, how to do something rather complex like tying a knot, it would be very difficult to explain in so many words how that knot is to be tied. But in an instant I can show you. And in this way, a picture shows us far more than words ever can. And so it's closer to nature. But then the question arises, is painting something purely representational? Is it an activity, in other words, in which man confronts nature, looks at it, and copies it? This is a problem that arose not only in the Far East, but also arises today in the world of contemporary art, contemporary painting, which incidentally has felt to some considerable extent the influence of Far Eastern ideas, and particularly of Zen. Now, very often now we go to our museums and art galleries, and we see something on the walls, which a kind of ordinary Joe says, "That doesn't look to me like a painting." No, because he has expected to see a representation of something. He is expected to see the artist do by hand what the camera does mechanically. And it doesn't strike him that a painting does not have to be a picture. It doesn't necessarily have to copy nature. And thus, in the Far East, under the influence of Taoism and Buddhism, there has been evolved what you might call the natural art of painting, or painting considered not as a copy of nature, but as a work of nature. And this has been shown in an exemplary way by artists who were trained in Zen. In other words, they would master a technique by all kinds of careful training. And then, when that mastery of technique, first of all, learning to write Chinese characters, after that, learning the basic alphabet of strokes necessary for painting, when they had mastered that technique, they would give themselves up completely to spontaneity. One of the most interesting examples of this is a great Japanese master of the 13th century called Sesshu. And if you look closely at this painting, you can see two things. First of all, there's its undoubted technical excellence. And secondly, if you look closely, you can see its relationship to writing, to the use of the brush for drawing letters, what you might call the calligraphic. Perhaps you know the word calligraphic simply means beauty of writing. So calligraphy is beautiful writing. But you can see the calligraphic character of this painting. And you can see that Seshu had the most astonishing technique. I mean, he was no one who, like some people suspect some contemporary artists of being, a person who couldn't draw and therefore did something formless instead. But now what happens when a man like Seshu really lets himself go? What is it? It's not perhaps until you begin to move up the painting bed and see what lies above that you begin to recognize that this is a mountain landscape. And this is done with incredible speed. Seshu sometimes, in order to get a kind of rough effect, would use straw with the ink on instead of a brush. Now, what happens when the same thing is done in writing? The formal character of writing gives way to a purely spontaneous way of writing in what is called grass style. Here is a poem which says, "The morning dawns, but the dusky night follows soon. So is life like a crystal drop of dew. Unconcerned, the morning glory goes on, blooming, blooming, its short yet full life." Well, I happen to know the translation, but I can assure you that when you get into that kind of grass style of writing, which looks almost like the tendrils of the morning glory, Japanese has almost as much difficulty in reading it as we have. Now, let us consider the medium more carefully with which this work is done. First of all, consider the brush. A great deal of our painting is, of course, done with rather firm brushes, the kind of bristles in use for oil. But the Chinese brush is an astonishingly flexible thing. And notice that it is used with the wrist unsupported. You don't use it like this and sort of scratch your drawing away, as we do with a pen. Your arm is free, and therefore, as it were, the dynamics of your whole body go into making a brush stroke. And in this way, the brush, being so responsive to your slightest motion, reveals character more strongly than anything else. Next, consider ink. Actually, although this is black ink, rubbed from a solid stick of ink, you might say that it's capable of enormous variations in color. You can mix it with varying degrees of water and show all kinds of depths of black, so that it has tremendous variation. And also here, where the brush runs dry, you get a kind of what they call flying hairlines, which show the motion of the stroke. You know, sometimes when we want to show motion, in somebody, say, is moving his hand, and here we've got an arm, and somebody is hitting somebody over the head with it. Well, to show that the arm is moving, we do little things like this. To show, here's a hammer in the hand, you see, and the hammer is coming down. Well, to show motion, we do this. But in this way, motion is shown in Chinese painting and writing by the flying hairlines of the brush, which give a dynamic quality. Now, another thing that's very important about the medium for purposes of Zen art is the quality of the paper or silk. upon which the painting or writing is done. This is absorbent paper, and therefore you notice that if I don't draw a line smoothly, but I hesitate, in a little while you will see that becomes an area where the ink, too much ink has run onto the paper and you get a bulge. And therefore, unless you intentionally want a bulge at a particular point, your motion, writing with the brush, must be entirely smooth. There, I want it to bulge. And in this sense, there is a kind of parallel between painting and life. You know, as Omar Khayyam says, the moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on. Not all thy piety nor wit can lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. And so in the same way, the painter or the writer in this medium has to move without hesitation. As our own proverb says, he who hesitates is lost. And thus, it involves particularly the quality of what is called in Zen, mo chur chu, going straight aheadness without doubt. And this quality, when it is ingrained in our character, through learning to trust our own spontaneity, becomes the greatest instrument of the artist. And the man, in other words, who has that character, can, however he goes at this, hardly make a mistake. His character is revealed in everything that he does, and as his action is completely unobstructed, so there is a kind of flowing vitality in all of his work. So, in this sense, the man who is, as it were, dead to himself. There is a Zen poem which says, while living, be a dead man, thoroughly dead. And then whatever you do, just as you will be right. So a man who has this becomes a superb artist. Now, one of the most interesting characteristics of Zen art is its kind of playfulness. Because you see, a person who has died to himself doesn't take himself seriously any longer. He has a sense of life, as we say in our own slang, not being any longer a drag. He's not in conflict with himself. He has already, as it were, given himself up to death. And so here is his spirit in a painting by Sengai, a great Zen master of the 17th century, which shows Hotei. You know, you often see him as the so-called fat Buddha. You can buy figures of him in any Chinese artwork store. Hotei. He's a kind of a tramp. And here he's waking up from his sleep. And the poem written above him on the painting says, Buddha is already dead. Maitreya, who's supposed to be the next Buddha to come in many years, Maitreya has not yet come. I have had a wonderful sleep and didn't even dream about Confucius. It seems, you see, a kind of irreligious attitude. For just as the art of Zen is artless art, so the religion of Zen is religion without religiosity. The masters are never drawn in a kind of pompous, sacred style, but always looking more like hobos and bums. This painting is a Chinese painting entitled Zen Master in Meditation, but he looks more as if he was asleep. And this I would call, this drawing of the saint meditating as if he were asleep, a kind of religion of no religion which doesn't take itself seriously. There was once a Zen student who asked his teacher how he was getting along in his study of Zen. And the teacher said, "You're all right, but you've got a trivial fault." "And what's that?" "You've altogether too much Zen," he replied. "Well," he said, "if you're studying Zen, isn't it very natural to talk about it?" "Oh," he said, "when it's like an everyday conversation, it's somewhat better." And here you see in another painting by Sengai, it's an everyday matter, just blossoms. And yet this is Zen. Or these marvelous persimmons by the great Chinese Zen monk Mu Chi. Just persimmons sitting there in a spirit of what is called in Japanese sonomama. Sonomama means just like that. I can perhaps illustrate the spirit of sonomama by a haiku poem which says, "Weeds in the rice field, cut them down and sonomama, just as they are, fertilizer." Or again, Sengai, showing the two Buddhist hermits, Hanshan and Shirta, looking like a pair of idiots. Because again, just as Zen represents its religion in the secular, its holiness in a kind of fat tramp looking as if he was fast asleep, and its wisdom as the behavior of a lunatic, you see, it doesn't take itself seriously. Here is a Zen painter of modern times, Saburo Hasegawa, a self-portrait. And the writing underneath is a quotation from Lao Tzu. "The people of the world seem so satisfied, as if partaking of a formal dinner, as if climbing a terrace in springtime. I alone am mild, like one with nothing to do, like a baby that cannot yet smile, unattached, as if without a home. The people of the world seem to have everything, but I seem to have lost everything. Mine is the heart of a fool." And here again is another piece by Hasegawa. It's a print from an old boat that was washed up on the beach, and the character written over it is time. And here again, you see, in this marvelous arrangement of the natural grain in wood, we have the artist expressing once again that character I showed you in the last talk, Li, which means the infinitely complex patterning of nature. And so it is playing on. And you may ask, what does it mean? What do the stars mean? What does the wind say? Where are the clouds going? Man at his birth is supple and tender, but in death he is rigid and hard. Thus suppleness and tenderness accompany life, but rigidity and hardness accompany death. I was quoting Lao Tzu. The philosophy of the strength of weakness. You know, it's a strange thing how I think men in the West, and particularly men in the United States, don't realize how much softness is strength. One of old Lao Tzu's favorite analogies was water. He spoke of water as the weakest of all things in the world. And yet there is nothing to be compared with it in overcoming what is hard and strong. You know, you can cut water with a knife. It lets the knife go right through, but when the knife is withdrawn, There's not even the trace of a wound. And Lao Tzu also said that while being a man, one should retain a certain essential feminine element. And he who does this will become a channel for the whole world. The ideal of the 100% tough guy, the rigid, rugged fellow with muscles like rocks, is really a weakness. Probably we assume this sort of tough exterior as a hard shell to protect ourselves not so much from the outside as from fear of weakness on the inside. What happens if an engineer builds a completely rigid bridge? If, for example, the Golden Gate or the George Washington bridges didn't sway in the wind, if they had no give, no yielding, they'd come crashing down. And so you can always be sure that when a man pretends to be 100% man, he's in doubt of his manhood. If he can allow himself to be weak, he can allow himself what is really the greatest strength not only of human beings, but of all living things.